Good afternoon, all. If you'd like to take the seats, please, we'll get going. So welcome everybody to the 2023 LIFTS Group annual general meeting and then technical seminar. Great to see so many people here again in person, which is great. I should make you aware that we are recording this evening's session just so that we can offer it up on our LIFTS Group website for future. There's no fire alarms planned, but if we do obviously hear an alarm, the emergency escapes are clearly notified. Please ensure your phones are off or on silent. And that's about it, I think, housekeeping wise. So we'll step through, as many of you that may have been to these sessions before will remember, the first part of this evening's meeting is the annual general meeting that just looks back on the LIFTS Group health, the events that we've held, the events that we're planning to hold, the executive committee members, treasury report, and an opportunity for you as members of the LIFTS Group to raise any issues that you'd like considered in the year ahead. And then we transfer over to the focus of this evening's meeting, I think, which is the technical seminars and the two very apt and timely presentations I think we've got this evening on the challenges of telecoms. So without further ado, our agenda for the AGM. A welcome and apologies. So we've had the welcome. Minutes of the previous meeting. So you'll be aware that on the CIBSE LIFTS Group website, we post minutes of the executive committee meetings and minutes of the last AGM. I'm not aware of any comments on those minutes. And unless anybody has a comment now they wish to raise, we will assume that those are accepted as accurate minutes. We're then going to talk about matters arising, do a report for 2022. We're going to talk about the election of officers for the executive committee, review events, education, training and CPD, a little bit about finances, a little bit about standards and regulations, any other business, and then the date of the next annual general meeting. Matters arising, and we have no matters arising from the exec committee side. If there's any particular matters arising that you would like to raise now, please shout. Think so. Excellent. Report for 2022. I shall hand over to Chuan to just talk us through the activity that the group had on the year just gone.
So organized the same seminars during the same duration. So the AGM last year, June seminar in Manchester, which was attended by, I think, or registered by 50 people. And then the annual seminar in November. I think we go to the next slide. We also talk about the different escalator symposium, which was held in September. I think the numbers were, I mean, it was the first symposium after the COVID. So I think the turnout was actually very good. And it was held first time at the Hilton Hotel in Northampton, which is a new venue. So it was all really good. This year, registration is open. I think we'll talk about it in the next slide. Adam. Election of officers, next slide. So these are the nominations for this year. The execs have all agreed and are putting it forward. So I need a proposer from the audience. Anybody want to be the proposer for the nominations? I'll propose. I'll get your name after that. And then in the secondary. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I'll just, as I take my chairman's hat off, I'll stay for the rest of the session to chair the session, but just to welcome Mike as chair of the LIFTS Group moving forward. Did you want to just say a few words, Mike?
I'd like to thank you all for the appointments of all the officers for the ensuing year. I'd like to thank Adam for the work that he's done over the last 4 years. I think it's 4, isn't it?
I outstay my welcome, Mike. I know
that. And he's going to be a tough act to follow. Adam, you've done an excellent job all round. You've been perfectly happy to trail up to Manchester and put up with these roughnecks up north. We've enjoyed your company. So I'm hoping in next year we're going to have a particularly exciting time. We've got a good start this evening, and we've got more meetings to come. We'll have the June meeting in Manchester. We'll have a November meeting here, and we'll also have an additional meeting, we think, in December. But more about that once the details are firmed up. So thank you very much for the confidence that you've shown in myself and also the rest of the executive.
Thank you, Mike.
So briefly mentioning the events for this coming year, Gina, you want to talk about?
Yeah, we've got the usual pattern we've got today. We're talking about the digital switch and such. We'll have a meeting in Manchester. Our topic for that will be accessibility. There's a lot going on in that particular area. The details will be released nearer to the date. Then the lift and escalator symposium in September in Northampton. Then the 29th of November 2023. That's the wrong date, isn't it? Because if we link with
we have to decide who to perform if we're going to link it with that. But at the moment, it's 29th of November. If we do merge it with the build to perform, we'll obviously post the updates on the Lift Group website.
Okay. We've been invited last year to join in with the build to perform at Excel, and we said our arrangements have gone too far ahead to actually take up that. But it's a big event down there, and we are thinking of just joining in as they suggested, provided that they can provide us with some room like this in order to make the presentations. The topic at the moment is safe working on lifts, BS 7255, which is at a very advanced state of revision. And we may introduce some safe working on escalators and lifting platforms as well. So that will be the theme for the annual seminar in November.
I know if Richard Peters was here with respect to the LES, the Lift and Escalator Symposium, he would be flying the flag for that and trying to encourage us all to engage and think about whether we would like to speak at it. I know some of you will be aware I've done that a few times. I know other faces in here have done it. It is an experience. It's a good experience to share your knowledge, and I'd encourage anybody here that's thinking about that. Think about a topic. You know, it's open for abstracts. So an abstract means, if you like, a summary of a topic that you'd like to discuss. I'd like to present rather, and I know that all abstracts will be welcome.
Before you go to the next slide, Adam, that QR code, you'll see a few of them tonight. If you have a smartphone and camera, feel free to aim it at the QR code now. It'll take you to the Lift Group website if you have never been to the website. And there is a contact form on it that you can post any questions, suggestions, or topics that you want to know more about to us. And then we will try our best to try and organize something.
Item 7 on our agenda then, education, training and CPD. So this is a bit of a headline slide. So I had a phone call from Nick Meller. Many of you will know Nick. So Nick is the managing director of LEA. And he was saying to me with my chair of CIBSE Lift Group hat on, saying, isn't it a bit strange that we talk to each other, but only in passing, you know, and not formally? There isn't any formal connection between LEA and CIBSE Lift Group. And I think some of that's historic, you know, some of there's commercial sensitivities involved and all sorts of other things to consider. But Nick has asked the CIBSE Lift Group whether we would entertain the idea of forming some kind of more formal communication with them. And we discussed that in the exec committee just prior to this session and agreed that we thought that was a fantastic idea. So the intent, I will go back to Nick at LEA and say, yeah, we think that's a great idea to start to share knowledge. I think the sense is that might become maybe a 6-monthly meeting, you know, a formalized meeting that's probably minuted, that just records topics of mutual interest that are discussed. Clearly, from our perspective, I think in the Lift Group, the one area that we see as an immediate opportunity is sharing of safety related knowledge. Leah, we're aware, posts a number of safety alerts each year, which I know get distributed amongst the Leah members. My sense, our sense is that they could be distributed a bit wider. And I know from Lick's side that he perceives that there's lots of knowledge in CIBSE List Group that could be fed back through into Leah members and help the Leah members. So that's a new initiative for 2023 that we're hoping will bear some interesting fruit. I'd like now just to hand over to Paul, just to chat through part of his new role in the exec committee in terms of training and promotion.
Thank you. So I'll be sort of heading up the LinkedIn posts and updates. We've put together a bit of a program on what we're going to post, try and do a couple a month and send over any topics that you have.
And I think we want to reinvigorate the whole LinkedIn and social media aspects of the group. And again, if you have suggestions on what you want to know topic-wise, please drop us an email or use the contact form on the website, right? But look out for the amazing articles that Paul will be posting on the LinkedIn account.
So the CIBSE List Group comes screaming into the 21st century. And the QR code, LinkedIn, it's all happening. Treasurer's report for 2022.
Should come be here, but I mean, on the printed agenda, you guys would have seen a copy of what the report. Essentially, we're still paying still some money in the account.
I know on that, we are a financially secure group because we're active and we've got attendance and we run events and people contribute and engage. And we had a visitor at our exec committee upstairs just now, who's the chief executive of CIBSE, and we were talking to her about some issues, but she commented that the List Group continues to be perceived as an exemplar within CIBSE in terms of the frequency of events and the engagement. But one of the issues we have is knowing who our members are. And by some measures, there's 4,000 members of the CIBSE List Group. So we kind of asked the question, well, we've got a nice number of people here this evening, but out of 4,000 people invited, we wonder why we only get 60 or 70. So we're trying to just engage and uncover a bit more about who is part of the List Group and try and improve that communication and correspondence with people.
I think just to touch on that, we're all volunteers, and and if you know of people who are not part of the group, please encourage them to join us. It's free to be part of the List Group. Yeah, and I think also in the year we're going to touch on things about professional qualification, scholarship, etc. in terms of the LinkedIn postings. So the more people who connect with us on the LinkedIn and the List Group, the closer you'll be updated when things get posted.
But item 9 is standards and regulations. So we could talk till 7, 8 o'clock on standards and regulations. What we will do is append to the minutes a more detailed set of headline comments, what's going in standards and regulations, because there is an awful lot going on at the moment. And I would encourage anybody that needs to know about standards and what's coming up to engage with this topic, because there's an awful lot happening. Some of the headlines, I'll chat to the first couple and then Jean will chat to the last 3. Many of you will be aware of evacuation lifts. Yeah, so this is driven particularly in London, the London plan requiring evacuation lifts for not just safe access to buildings, but safe egress, safe and dignified egress. Some of you will be aware that there was a draft European standard that went through public comment probably 18 months ago, part 76. That generated, I think, more comments than any other standard. It resulted in a no vote from the UK. In other words, the UK British Standards Technical Committee felt that they could not work with the technical content of the standard. A very rare event for British Standards to vote no on a standard of this scale. We were not the only ones. There were 2 other countries. It resulted in part 76 going back to the drawing board in inverted commas and starting again. Hence the reason why it's been in draft for what feels like years and we still haven't seen it. There are something like 170 pages of comments that the technical committee are working their way through. The update that Gina and I received yesterday in the MHE4 meeting was that there's a hope that the technical comments should be agreed around the middle of this year, but the standard itself is still unlikely to be seen much before early to middle of next year. But the one thing that agreement on the technical comment can release relates to the second item there, BS 391, which, as you'll be aware, is all to do with fire management and fire design in residential buildings. So it's linked into the Building Safety Act, high-risk buildings, much broader scope than just lifts, but it contains comment on lifts. So it remains in draft at the moment. And it remains in draft at the moment because it's linked to Part 76. So we cannot publish 391 with evacuation lift requirements that may then conflict or repeat the requirements that come out in 76. So the latest advice on 391 is that that is likely to be published at the back end of this year. So once the technical content of Part 76 is agreed, 391 can then be released into the UK market. So that hopefully will start to remove a little bit of doubt as to how evacuation lift design is going to evolve over the next year or so, particularly in response to the London plan. And as we've talked before, you know, often what happens in London ends up going throughout throughout the UK. So evacuation lifts is going to be a really hot topic over the next 12, 18 months. But hopefully we start to see some standards coming out to confirm the requirements. Accessibility, just an observation that many of you will have picked up that there was an addendum to the Part 70 that came out just before Christmas. It's a small addendum, but it's a pretty significant one. And it updates, changes and introduces a measurement methodology for some of the contrast elements, the really important bits that talk about, you know, how can I find controls, how can I find symbols in an accessible lift. So if you haven't seen that, that's worth getting hold of. And then obviously Part 70 as an accessibility standard is now in its next cycle of technical review. I think the standard is likely to come out again for public comment next year, which is its next kind of regular review. Gina, would you like to talk to the last three, please?
Okay. BS 7255 is the version that we're currently working with is 2012. So it's 10 or 14 years out of date when you consider how long it takes to write these particular documents. So we've taken the MHE4 committee at BSI has taken the current 7255, created a panel which includes members of MHE4, but a lot of co-opted people from the industry as well. And we basically revamped how 7255 is constructed. If you remember it, the section 4, which is to do with owners, and section 5, which is to do with workers, well, we've sort of merged those together so that everything that's repetitive in those two sections is not repetitive. So we have a general section, a section on owners, and a section on workers. But a lot has changed since 2012. One of the most significant ones that you'll be aware of is the opportunity to have pit inspection control stations. You have to have them on new lifts, and they're getting into the older lifts, older stock. So we're adding some extra appendices on how to access pit. We already have how to access the car top. So it will be a body text where we've merged in the owners and workers and a general section, plus a number of supporting annexes. And that's why I think this would be a very suitable topic to look at in the annual seminar at the end of the year. The document may not be published by the end of the year, but we're determined to actually finish the text, get it into BSI to do their editing, to make sure we use the right words in the right way, to go out as a draft for public comment, those comments to be received, dealt with, and finally publish a new version. So hopefully it'll be late 23, early 24 when we get a new 7255. On alarms, there is some work going on Part 28, but it's more tinkering around the edges than actually substantial. And of course, this evening's meeting is going to talk about the things that are not in Part 28, how you communicate between the lift and the rescue centre. Modernisation. Modernisation is now, well, by the time we publish anything, it'll be 20 years out of date, a very important document. When you're doing a modernisation, you should be using parts 11 and 12 as your Bible. If you change something, then you should be looking at 11 or 12. 11 is electric, 12 is hydraulic. You should be looking at those sections to see what else you have to do. For instance, if you change the weight of the car, don't forget you've got to do even traction calculations again and check that the counterweight is correct and so on. If you change the speed, there's all sorts of things in there that, you know, overheads and pit depths that you need to look at. But this was written in 2005 and it's based on the 1998 suite of standards. And we've now got EN 81 2050, 2014 and the 2020 version, which is almost identical except for the ZA thing at the front, which has changed quite a number of things. Again, we're looking at the possibility of joining 11 and 12 together. A lot of repetition in 11 and 12. They've all got doors, buffers and things. So the idea is to combine the electric and the hydraulic. And we have a draft already. And BSI committee yesterday, was it yesterday? Well, yes, yesterday, set up a panel to actually get that work through. We have to receive approval for resource from BSI. They have to engage with a content editor and finally push it through into publication. So that work might be finished towards the end of the year, and then it goes through the process I described for 7255. There are lots of other things, lots of other standards and things that we've been looking at in BSI. I suggest that we don't make them a topic of the AGM. You may want to bring them up at any other business bit at the end of the two presentations this evening.
Thank you, Gina. Just a final comment on codes and standards. So whilst my chairmanship moves to Mike's capable hands, I retain the lead point of contact within the list group for the liaison with BSI, with Gina's support. So please feel free, if there's any questions on standards, drop me a line. Yeah, I probably won't know the answer, but I'll try and find out the answer. Yeah, because I know it can be quite complicated and sometimes these standards appear out of nowhere. The other thing I'm very conscious that I need to do better is when standards come out for public comment, or indeed when they're actually finally published, is getting a piece of news out to list group members so that you know it's out there. And as you've heard me say before, the public comment piece is really challenging, I think, because as an industry, it's hard to find the time. Yeah, it's easy to complain about the standards when they come out, but we have the power. Yeah, and having been inside the BSI process and a bit of the European standard formation, I am 100% confident that every single comment is looked at. It has to be, because there's so much politics and commerce involved in standards that there has to be an auditable trail that says every comment made is looked at. You may not get the change that you request, but it will be looked at. So investing time in making comment on draft standards is time very, very well spent. And as an industry, I believe, should be engaging in that process more to guide and improve the standards. Ultimately, the industry contains the people that know best how to implement those standards and how to draft them. Final part of our AGM then, any other business? Does anybody have anything that they would like to raise? Alan.
And obviously it's all based about me. Is there any link between the next group and any, okay, quite emotional, bear with me a second, with Future Leaders Next Gen? So I've just come along with two colleagues who are somewhat of a different generation than myself, and sadly many of them in the room. And I think that would be a nice thing to consider. I don't know if it is.
It's a good question. I'm very aware that CIBSE have a YEN, the Young Engineers Network, and I know BCO, for example, have a Next Gen network as well. We will we'll welcome it. Yeah,
Let's say again, CIBSE lift group.
there isn't at the moment.
Well,
The founders of it may be sat next to you. No, there isn't. And I mean, I think we were talking in the exec committee upstairs, you know, some of you in here tonight may remember probably 10 years ago, we had a presentation competition for apprentices. Yeah, and I think 10 apprentices did presentations here in this room to the lift group committee. There was an award for it to try to encourage people to engage at different levels in the business. We welcome the conversation. Yeah, because I think it's all linked into transfer of knowledge and training and the future of our industry. And maybe if you drop me a note or something, we can try and just make sure that that conversation doesn't disappear when we leave the room. Anything else? No. Okay. Date of next AGM. I will obviously circulate that date in future and obviously promote and publicise the events as they come up during the year. As Tryon said, we've got there the QR code to take you to the Lifts Group website. Please remember there's a dedicated website for CIBSE Lifts Group and contact portals there. All the minutes and meetings are there, all the presentations are there, recordings are there, links to symposium presentations. So it's easy to forget that even if you haven't been to the Lift and Escalator Symposium or you missed one, certainly all the recent ones were recorded. There's video films of them, yeah, and all the content, all the abstracts are freely available. And it's a wealth of information. It's all electronically searchable, so you can search for a particular keyword. You want to see whether there's been any kind of presentation or content created. And then there's the link there to the CIBSE Lifts Group LinkedIn site, which again, we're trying to encourage and promote activity and action on. I know many are better at it than I am, that's for sure. And with that, that concludes the AGM. Thank you very much. And I'll pass over to Dr. Barney, who's now going to host our evening meeting and our speakers. Gina.
We start 5 minutes early. That must be a record.
Oh.
That gives us another 5 minutes to talk about other things. So we have the next slide. I'll get the staff going. Right, the agenda is very simple. We're going to have two speakers. First one is Matt Davis. He's written up some of his presentations in the lift industry news, for instance. And the second one is going to be by Jason Godwin. You'll have seen the abstracts for them. And I propose that they get up and introduce themselves, that they go through the two presentations end to end, and then we've got a lot of time to talk about it afterwards. So can I welcome Matt to actually make the first presentation?
No.
And while he's getting up, I'm going to talk about a little bit of deja vu, because in 2008 and a bit before it, I was the convener of a panel that MHE4 had. They received a request from the industry through LEAR for a protocol for communications between a lift alarm system and an alarm receiving station. And we produced a specification in 2008. A draft of development dies after 3 years. If it doesn't get converted into a standard, it just dies, but it's there as a discussion document. You may be invited towards the end of this meeting to think of something similar for the topic that we're talking about tonight. What's the next slide?
Yes, go to the next slide, Matt.
Okay.
Thank you, Gina. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Davies. I'm the head of strategic marketing for Europe for Avaya. First piece of business, we've seen sense, and we're going to go back to calling ourselves Memco, which is our original UK brand. So I'm sure many people will be happy with that, and I'll certainly be happy with it because I can now go and visit people and introduce myself as Matt from Memco, and people know what I'm talking about, whereas I go Matt from Avaya and they go, what's that? So going straight in, the digital switch. Just to set the scene, I know some of you may have already seen information about this. We're talking about the nationwide upgrade of the old analog copper-based telecom system to a fibre-based system. You'll also hear this referred to as fibre to the premises. So it's where a fibre line will run all the way into the premises and ultimately to whatever is connected on the other side of it. The copper network's no longer fit for purpose. Why is that? It's because landlines now are seen as a medium to get you an internet connection, not primarily for a voice connection. So voice has been essentially downgraded in terms of the priority, and it's all about delivering you faster and faster internet. This means the end of analog support on what we would call the public switch telephone network, the PSTN, aka landlines. What that's going to mean is we're going to lose the 48 volts of power that we currently receive over a copper line. There will also be an initial reduction in and then ultimately complete removal of analog signaling. And specifically here, the dual tone multi-frequency signaling, DTMF or touch tone as it's referred to, which is a crucial part of how lift alarms today operate. The driver behind this is that the government predict that full fibre will add a whopping £59 billion boost to UK productivity by 2025. Exactly what they mean by that is less clear. Previously, changes to the telephone line network haven't affected us, mainly because the big changes all preceded the introduction of EN 8128 and the rollout of the lift alarm as we know it today. So what's the impact on lift alarms? The estimate which floats around is that of our, say, 310,000 lifts in the UK, 257,000 are still connected to landlines. That figure may be a little high as we sit today, but it's still the majority of lift alarms sit on a fixed line. DTMF signaling, analog signaling, is required for the 3-day test calls that those alarms emit, which, as we know, is a key piece of EN 8128. And ultimately, it's an essential piece of knowing that that lift alarm is there when a passenger may need to use it. Analog support on fibre lines currently varies massively between communication providers. A communication provider is who you pay your bill to. So it's BT, it's Sky, it's TalkTalk. And I've got a slide later on where I talk about some of the testing we've done. The biggest thing to remember here, and what I will bang on about incessantly, is a mains power failure will lead to a fibre telephone line failing. Fibre telephone lines have numerous pieces of equipment, all of which need mains power from the building. If that mains goes away, which is also an ideal time to have a lift trapping, you will lose the line. As I've said, analog support at the moment varies wildly. At the end of 2025, it will be removed completely across the network. So there will be no analog support from any communication provider in the UK. Another thing that I want to talk about is in the background to all of this, there's what Openreach are calling their Stop Cell program. This goes nationwide September of this year, and it's essentially, as far as I'm concerned, a stealth rollout of fibre and the removal of copper from the network. So a quick conversation about the pace of change. Currently, we have 7 million premises in the UK which are served by fibre. If we look back to 2019, that figure was only 685,000. They targeted 3 million by the end of 2020, but they had a whale of a time during the pandemic when we were all sat at home, digging up the roads and laying fibre. So they hit 4.8 million. They're now at 7 million. The aim is to be at 10 million by the end of this year. The map you can see here, and there's a link at the bottom of the slide, shows you the progress of fibre builds, and you can push in at the individual exchange level to understand where a certain area will be and how far it is in its fibre rollout. The really interesting thing here is this Stop Cell program. When an exchange area reaches 75% fibre, no new analog services will be available. Their definition of new is incredibly broad. So if you have a change of communication provider, you're not happy with how much you pay BT, so you move to Sky, that counts as new, so you get given fibre. Working line takeover, where a tenant leaves a building and a new tenant comes in and takes over the line. That also counts as new. You will essentially be force-fed fibre. There's 658 exchanges that are currently under stop sell. As of September, the whole country goes stop sell. So any changes to existing analog lines will result ultimately in fibre being run in. I think that's the biggest threat to us, because we could well have equipment that the building believes is on an analog line, but something has happened in and around that line that fibre's been run and nobody realizes it. And to give you an example there, I put in our address here tonight, and you can see there, the blue areas are where they are, I believe it's over 50% into their build. The green areas, they've completed their build. Orange goes in this year. The darker blue goes in next year. So it's by no means everywhere, but it's very advanced. And I would suggest that those green areas quite near here, you already cannot get new analog lines, and the analog lines are already being changed over for fibre. So testing of current technology. That little diagram there is what we've all been used to. The BT master socket and the emergency phone plugged into it, with the master socket distributing 48 volts of power over that connection. That goes away, and we have this scheme whereby you have the optical network termination point provided by Openreach as the infrastructure provider, a fibre router, which is provided by the communication provider, i.e. who the building is paying the bill to. And then what we've seen, which is quite interesting, is a number of the commercial line providers, so BT Enterprise and so on, bring in a third piece of kit, which is an analog telephone adapter. What that's allowing you to do is support the existing analog alarm on the lift out and through the fibre network. We've tested at the Openreach Digital Services Lab in London. That's allowed us to test on BT, TalkTalk, Sky, Vodafone and Zen. We've then run extended testing with BT at their site in Ipswich, with TalkTalk in Warrington, with Sky in London, and with Virgin Media over in Reading. A document which is floating around also relates to a field trial that we did over in Wimbledon. It was with Galliard Homes, the developer, and Coney were the lift provider. Galliard have a lot of concerns because they have a number of applications, not just lifts, which don't sit particularly easily on fibre lines. And one of the things we need to be aware of is that within the scheme of this change, there's a lot of other things, dare I say it, some of them more safety critical than us. For example, level crossings and traffic lights that are having to be dealt with because today they sit on copper lines. They had a number of concerns. Lifts was one of them. Openreach have now published a case study, and the wording is fibre worked adequately. So what does adequately mean? Well, what we've seen is that the use of analog telephone adapters is slightly problematic. Most of these devices are off-the-shelf devices from providers like Cisco. They are great for a fax machine, but they are not great for our application. We've seen a variance of performance. My biggest concern with these is I've seen active disruption during alarm calls. The ATA doesn't keep the line clear, so the auto dialer on the other side thinks it's detecting tones, which will cause it to do things like play its location message and so on. If there's one thing in this application which I think is a complete no-no, it's any disruption to an alarm call. The bigger concern is the provisioning of battery backup. Now, all three of those items there, the ONT, the fibre router, and the analog telephone adapter where used, run from mains power. So in the event of mains power failure, we need either a battery backup that serves all three or individual battery backups. Battery backups will not be provided as standard. Ofcom, the telecoms regulator, has made it quite clear they only require a battery backup for what they're describing as a vulnerable customer. A vulnerable customer, even then, only needs to be able to place a 999 call. And as we all know, we cannot have lift alarms going to 999. There's also, on the battery backups we have seen, which have to be purchased separately. Some providers will not provide them. BT Enterprise have been quite clear they will not be providing battery backups. There's no form of remote monitoring. There's no way of these devices giving a signal that they have a problem. So it's all going to be reliant on on-site visual inspection. When we did the trial site with Galliard Homes, the solution to this was have the building concierge go and physically look at the battery backup every day. I can tell you when we were there, the biggest thing that guy cared about that day was booking in Amazon packages, because they also have a behind door Amazon delivery service in that block. So the real risk here is, how are those ATAs going to perform? And if there's a mains power failure, what condition are those battery backups in, and will they be there when they're needed? So what are the potential solutions? So provisioning of lines sits with the lift owner. It doesn't sit with lift companies. It sits actively outside of the standards, as Gina alluded to earlier. One of the first assumptions that's used in EN 8128 is that the communication network does not fail. The UK will be the third digital switch that I've gone through. Previously, I'd worked on the digital switch that went through in Australia and Switzerland. Lift industries in both of those regions moved 100% to gateways over the mobile network after their digital switches. They both had too many concerns about the resilience of fibre lines, specifically in the event of power outages. And it was just felt that from a safety perspective, you could no longer have lift alarms sat on these lines, which were likely to go away whenever the power failed. So the alternative to a fixed line is a 4G gateway. This can be provisioned and maintained by the lift maintenance provider, so it can be bought in as part of the overall lift spec. They should have inbuilt battery backups, and that inbuilt battery backup should be remotely monitored exactly like the auto dialer is today, either through the 3-day test call or by connection back to the same reception equipment. The use of roaming non-steered SIM cards allows us to maximize signal strength, both signal availability and signal strength. Now, I'll throw a spanner into my own works now and start talking about what's going on with the mobile networks in the form of mobile network sunsets. We will also see the end of the 2G and 3G networks in this country by the end of 2025. So this data comes from a network closure report that was put together by GSMA, which is the overall standards body for mobile communication. And as you can see, of the 4 big providers in the UK, 3 of them have published dates for a 2G and 2 of them have published for a 2G closure and 3 for a 3G closure. O2 are expected to announce their closure this year, and the indication they've given me is that their closure will also be the end of 2025. In the meantime, we are seeing a noticeable drop in the level of support for analog signalling over the 2G and 3G networks. I think it's fair to say we used to get away with analog signalling through those means, but it's definitely being eroded now. So don't get caught out fitting cheap 2G gateways today, because they will still need to be replaced in 2025. Many of the 4G gateways which are deployed are currently running their voice channel through the 2G and 3G bands. So there's also a consideration there around the SIM card that's used to make sure that the gateway is actually running in what we call voice over LTE. So the voice is being put through the 4G band, not the 2G and 3G. That loss of DTMF support will be critical. So to keep lift alarms in service, our advice is to use 4G gateways, which can essentially, for want of a better word, catch the DTMF as it is transmitted from the auto dialer, convert it into data, and then move it as data over the mobile network. So, key concerns with a move to GSM. This is all things which have been played out to me over the years, and I hope I can answer some of them. Mobile switch off in the event of a disaster. This is often cited as a concern. So this happened after the July 7th attacks and after the Manchester Arena bombings. The emergency services, the security services chose to deactivate the mobile network because of the fear of secondary devices which could be detonated remotely. The reports after both attacks judged that that hampered the rescue efforts. If nobody can use their mobile phone, it causes a lot more problems. The security services won't comment for obvious reasons on whether they'll do it again, but it looks like that is not necessarily going to be the standard response moving forward when disasters like this happen. Mobile network congestion, this does happen. It is fairly rare, I would say. It's one of the key areas that the mobile operators are continually investing in terms of bandwidth and coverage, because they want you to be on your phone all the time, and they don't want a situation where the network gets clogged. Can't get signal. The use of roaming SIM cards, we have high gain antennas, we have signal boosters now. All of these things are available to us, even in a machine room that's buried fairly deep in a building. Provided we can get the antenna away from that, we can get signal. The other thing is make sure people are not installing gateways on the top of lift cars. It is the quickest, dirtiest way to do it. It's the least effective way to do it. I have had a conversation with a lift engineer where he couldn't understand why the gateway didn't work in the -2 car parking level, which I said, does your mobile phone work? And he said, of course not, we're underground. Okay. So the other thing that we are seeing is a rise of what we call managed services, whereby the provisioning of the communication equipment and an element of signal monitoring and remote diagnostics is included as part of the provisioning of that equipment. There's also a lot of talk now around managing the life cycle of this equipment, because ultimately we're talking about the end of landlines effectively at the end of 2025 and the end of 2G. So fit 4G. I think we maybe have 6 to 8 years on 4G. We're not going to get 30 years out of it like we did on 2G. So the call to action, lift owners need to understand the following. They need to understand what they've got installed on the car, the level of compatibility with the fiber line, the rollout of the status, especially stop sell in their area. And the other thing that I would ask is that as an industry, we try and actually get some urgency around this. Building owners I've spoken to, lift owners I've spoken to, don't know this is happening. They see it as a telecoms thing that sits off to one side. There's a very real risk here that good equipment that's been specified, which is compliant to EN 8128, which is working fine, will be rendered useless because there's a power failure, there's a lift trapping, and the fiber line failed at the same time. So upgrading to a resilient solution, avoid the use of 2G and 3G today, avoid unmonitored batteries. Speaking to some engineers, we are starting to see things creep into the industry from outside the industry. We've heard horror stories of gateways being sourced for £40 from Amazon with no battery, with no real support in the UK. And we've also seen comms providers trying to fit things as well and not understanding what is on the other side of that. Gateways with DTMF to data conversion capabilities will keep existing lift alarms in service. There is not necessarily anything wrong with the lift alarm that is on the car today. We are talking about the communication link to the outside world. And also, there needs to be a long-term plan for connectivity. Network sunsets will continue. We don't want to go through this pain every 6 to 8 years of, right, all this kit's got to be stripped out, new kit's got to be in. We won't get 30 years on 4G. It will go away. What does that look like in terms of a connectivity that matches the life cycle of the lift, especially for owners who want lifts in for a long time on a long depreciation cycle? And consider moving to the managed services to ensure that that lifetime of the communication means, to borrow the only reference we have in the standards to it, can actually match the lifetime of the lift. Thank you, everyone, and I'll be back up here for a grilling later.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Jason Godwin. I'm the youngest of 3 sons from Mike Godwin, a name some may recollect. And he's still alive and kicking, so that's good as well. I did have 2 brothers, only got 1 now. Adrian, the eldest brother, sadly passed away, but his memory and good works in the lift industry, I'm sure, hold good today. I work for a company called 2N. It's based in Prague. I'm the regional sales manager covering the UK, North America, and Australia. And 2N is owned by Axis Communications of Sweden, which is a very large video surveillance system solutions company, ultimately owned by Canon of Japan as the group. So today I'm going to talk about emergency lift communications, DTMF, mobile GSM gateways. I think it'll build very much on what Matt was talking about, and my thanks to Matt for introducing that in a very competent manner. So going to sort of run through this content. I hope it's try not to make it too technical. It does build on the article I wrote in the Lift Industry News. I don't know if anyone had a chance to read that, but this does really build upon that. So that's what we'll cover as I go forward. So firstly, I thought I ought to remind, you know it better than I do probably, the way the EN 8128 sits and this boundary, and that's really quite important. That's really our focus. And I'm sure it was a good thing to draw a line around it and say, right, that's it. We're not going beyond that. But I think this day and age, and with, as I said, with what Matt has been talking about, we do need to consider other elements perhaps, but not within the code. I'm not suggesting a change to that necessarily, but to realize the impact of changing technologies on this. So anyway, there you see the boundary, and we'll be exploring that a little more. So as an introduction, and again, Matt covered this very well. The mobile GSM 4G gateways, they provide a very easy alternative to the fiber, the landlines that are now existing, that we're seeing rolled out with the problematic issues around power resilience and so forth. And they're being widely adopted. I mean, again, Matt mentioned 2G, 3G ones. Many have been deployed. They should certainly be looking at deploying now 4G. However, the suitability and performance of these gateways in respect to DTMF, again, for many of the reasons that Matt mentioned, is not ideal. They were never designed necessarily, the mobile networks, to support DTMF effectively. And that's where we are. That's a reality. Obviously, DTMF is integrated into lift communications, identification of lifts during a call, communication-related alerts, and very importantly, these 3-day test calls, and also some configuration. Often you can configure the auto dialer phone remotely using DTMF. So very important, the role it still has today. And EN 8128 clause 4.2.1 does make this important statement of using the same connection means used for an alarm for that test call. And really that's the focal point of what I'm presenting today, because we're a provider of gateways very successfully. We support Kone globally and many others, but we're realizing, based on this lack of suitability around GSM, that this needs to be addressed, needs to be a topic that needs to be aired, you could say. And we also have some industry feedback. It's always hard to get feedback, as you know. You ask for someone's comment, they'll give you something. You say, do you mind if I print that and put your name on it? Say, oh no, can't do that. So I did struggle a bit, but that shouldn't detract from there being an issue, I don't think. But anyway, you know, we do cover the whole of Europe. So there was one from a gentleman in France that a very good friend, Darren at Thames Valley, also offered a quote. Had to sort of nudge him a few times to get that, but very kind of him to have provided that. Here on the French side, and I mean, I would expect this to be equally relevant here in the UK. You see a massive 20% of these DTMF calls are impacted by distortion and other problems as they progress through the mobile networks. So it's a real issue potentially for the lift companies, for the industry as a whole. And I would say that our investigation, it tends to certainly reach the peak of problematic sort of repercussions when you hop from network to network. In other words, imagine your 4G or even 2G gateway may be on O2, but your actual call center, response center is on another network, perhaps Sky, Vodafone, BT, or whoever. The way in which DTMF is progresses across those networks through what are called media gateways and other routers and things really isn't very friendly to those poor tones. And as Matt indicated, there are some special considerations that are, maybe not faced with fax machines or others. And that can do often with the timing of the signaling of DTMF. It can be very short and easily corrupted or missed. So where are we today? Well, again, Matt covered this. The copper is really no more or very likely to disappear very shortly. And in its place, we're seeing fiber being rolled out, fiber to the premises, fiber to the street cabinets, but essentially fiber. And then, of course, and with all the problems that Matt alluded to, so I'm not really going to go into that, but point you to, of course, this mobile gateways and how that's handled. So you have a trapping, call goes out through the gateway. It's still converted, even if it goes out at voice, it's going to be converted at some point, probably at the base station there, through into the network. So it will be effectively modified in some respect. And then, of course, it goes off and finds its way, again, through whatever operators it may have to connect to through to the call center. And quite often that's an IP-based call center, and SIP trunking connects it to the network. So that's where we are. And of course, with the magical copper, it was never a problem. There was no conversion needed, no problems or anything like that. But that's where we are today. With the mobile gateways and their suitability around the DTMF is really the point in question. So key issues, yes, 2G will be switched off 2025. I think there's a bit of a game being played or will be played by the mobile operators to see who switches off first and the other takes advantage of that and maybe grabs some of the share for another couple of years, but who knows? We'll see. But that means no more CS, carrier switched voice from there on. And Matt mentioned the 2G, 3G. That's very much that carrier switched voice. So then it'll be voice over LTE, which is a form of VoIP, and that will remain the only option unless data is somehow utilized. As I mentioned, the calls, the DTMF pass through multiple operators quite frequently. If it was on one network, it probably would reduce the issues. In other words, if the mobile gateway was on EE and the call center was on BT, that might help. But this is not a very resilient manner in which to deal with the DTMF. Voice over LTE, although VoIP requires a voice plan, that's important because although VoLTE, as I just said, is VoIP, you can't actually make a call without having a voice plan. And of course, data requires a data plan. You'll be familiar with from your phone, of course, having a voice plan, data plan, and so forth. Okay, so two very different things. In a sense, the plan both would require to be active if both are to be used. So how did we approach this? Well, we recognize the issue with DTMF. And working with, in this case, as an OEM, I won't name it, but they asked us, look, what about just digitizing the DTMF? The voice can go out normally, that's not a problem. And then send the digitized DTMF through to a server. And then they'll log the test calls and everyone's happy. I can't say how they then reconstructed that DTMF to give a lift ID to the call center, but maybe they did, I don't know, or they relied on caller ID perhaps. But nevertheless, they could log all the test calls here and they were satisfied with that. Now, you please your customer, they asked for that, and a big customer at that, we said, there you go, good luck. But we mentioned the concern that the connection means for the emergency alarm calls, the voice call, it is of course a voice call, but the DTMF is going out as data, okay? Now, to our mind, that doesn't really conform with the spirit letter or intent of the standard and the way in which it's worded, if you were to go back at the slide at the beginning there. So that's our concern, is that they're using potentially two different routes, two different means, and the word means actually is quite important, to achieve this. Yes, the DTMF, when digitized through to the server, works very well, very clearly, but you see the dichotomy in the approach there. So, and I call it proprietary, but you know, this can be replicated by anyone, any company, I'm sure, is capable of creating this solution. So what we try to do is focus on something that's well, certainly not proprietary, something using open technology standards that would match up the voice call with the DTMF string. And since you can't really, well, we've already said the DTMF doesn't work well over the voice, you can then reverse that and say, well, what if we did the voice using data and the DTMF using data? Then you've got that same means for the test calls as for the alarm. And so what we've said is that, yes, digitalize the DTMF, but also digitalize the voice call. And the way to do that is quite a popular protocol known as CIP. It's a VoIP. CIP is a sort of a multimedia protocol. So it's voice, which is VoIP. It'll do video, it'll do messaging, it'll do pretty much everything. And that would allow DTMF to be utilized for many, many years to come. I think it's probably got a shelf life at some point, but nevertheless, you can still have the analog dialer you see here in the car. No need to change that. All the work's done in the gateway. That converts the voice to SIP and the DTMF, and off it goes as data. Okay, and in fact, you could then run a SIM card without a voice plan, so you'd even have a potential cost saving from that. So there's no separation in voice and DTMF. Test calls, alerts, lift ID are all sent over the same technology, same means, and so forth. So and I would point to, I'll touch on it in a moment when we get to the recommendations, but just to say about SIP, it may be a new word, it's Session Initiation Protocol, but it's very popular in the way it's been used, is being used today. So, you know, you may well use Microsoft Teams, you may be familiar with these other, Zoom, of course, more maybe North American, but Skype for business. So, you know, it's not something new. It's not something out there on the edge or something that's yet to be proven. It's very well proven, trusted. I like to think of it as creating like a VPN between the 2 points for voice, video, whatever, kind of a secure tunneling of that data. And in this case, DTMF and voice. But with the possibility for video, because you look at other markets like North America and the impact of the ASME 2019 and the need for messaging and video, well, SIP is the perfect thing to deliver that as well. So where do we stand in terms of recommendation? Well, I think there's a real need for the industry and particularly for CIBSE Lift Group to look at this in closer detail. Maybe there's a potential for a development draft to be put together and discussed, shared and commented upon. We're not looking to touch the EN 8128. We saw the boundary earlier. This doesn't affect that in any way. But to now air the issues that I've discussed, highlighted today, and SIP being one answer, maybe there are others, but certainly that provides a good alternative to the problems that we face today. And on the European level, I saw that there is a need on the ELA slides I saw recently to support the standardization in the use of VoIP. So it's not just the UK, it's Europe, it's the industry as a whole that it is looking to utilize VoIP. With VoIP, I suggest SIP being part of that as a way forward. So finally, I think it is actually possible to move beyond DTMF some years from now. So if one thinks about the what I sort of laid out here, that'll work for many years to come if it were to be utilized. But at some point, I think we could actually come up with a, well, you may be familiar with DTMF. There's some protocols at the call center side. P100, I think, is one, for instance, where particular DTMF tones signaling relate to certain information. That can easily be replicated with SIP, with messaging in SIP as well. We just need a simple listing agreement around what those messages mean and for that to be adopted. So eventually there is the opportunity to actually move beyond DTMF because it really is a legacy of the copper lines from many, many years, if not generations ago. With that, I'll say thank you. And I'm sure we'll be taking some questions in a moment.
Question. Jason, you talked about, or both of you guys talked about the fact that Part 28 is rightfully constrained to the design of the lift autodialer itself, and the way the infrastructure that facilitates the comms of the autodialer is outside of the scope of 28. Presumably, that infrastructure is governed by a set of its own standards. And is there an opportunity to lobby the standards makers that govern the design of that infrastructure to address the particular issues that we've got when it's connected to a lift system?
Well, it's a difficult one. I have to say, before I wrote the piece in Lift Industry News recently, I actually tried to contact the GSMA as an industry organization on the mobile side, because we are really talking about mobile gateways as the means, as the mechanism to be used. And well, I struggled to get any sort of response. It didn't seem to be of interest to them, really. You know, so I'm not saying that they won't engage at some point, but I think we've almost got to look at the tools that are available, VoIP, SIP being one, and look to some sort of advice, some standardization perhaps to the industry so that they know how best to proceed. I don't think we can sort of turn, unfortunately, to the telco sector and ask them to kindly provide leadership on the issue, unfortunately.
Because it's too niche from their perception.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
even though it's life safety.
yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, I you know, with all the gravitas I could, wrote to them and said, this is mandated by code, and the DTMF is disrupted and distorted, and we're losing the test calls, and the result of that could be a phone that's not ready to be used in case of emergency. So, but not easy to get. And that was the industry organization. So I don't want to tar the operators themselves, but one would have hoped for a better response from the industry association.
My experience absolutely echoes that as well. And you're right, we're too niche. They're interested, the mobile networks are interested in consumer mobile contracts. And the things that then all of the other applications that then hang off the network are absolutely a secondary consideration to them. And when you look at some of what they're developing in what they would describe as their IoT space, it doesn't have a voice channel, because what they're developing there is for things like standalone cash point smart meters, where again they see a big industry for that. And same experience with GSMA, same experience when talking directly with some of the operators. 300,000 lifts. What's the estimate? For everyone in the UK, there's 1.5 smart devices now, something like that. Yeah.
Very silly. If the importance is raising an alarm, why do we need the voice? And then if we don't need the voice, can we use what Apple are doing with the SOS satellites?
So 8128 specifically calls out that it needs to be two-way communication. So there needs to be voice back and forth. So we're tied to that voice channel. And ultimately, for reassuring a trapped passenger, it needs to be a human voice at the other end of it.
Very important. If you've ever been trapped, have you been trapped in a lift?
Unfortunately, not.
Any of you have been trapped in a lift?
You know, it's
A conversation with someone.
Poor person on the other end of that line.
I would just add to that, you know, rather than, you know, well, the code doesn't allow for it, but rather than even thinking to strip out voice, it's likely to become a much more richer communication experience towards the occupants, the passengers of the car, as I alluded to, and the codes here in Europe are likely, in my view, to pick up on that. We have inquiries relating to better support the deaf, the hard of hearing, who can best respond to visual messages, of course. Again, if you look at the American ASME 2019, 19.1, you've got the voice, of course, you've got the video surveillance of the cab itself, and you've got messaging with restricted to a yes/no response from the occupants, passengers, but nevertheless, something that those of hard of hearing could view and respond to. So the technology is there to deliver a very rich communication experience, provide greater support to those. I mean, you can imagine we've gone through COVID, of course, the focus on health, and you can not imagine a more anxious, a more stressful situation than being trapped in a lift. And so to have that richer communication experience with the rescue center, it can only be a positive thing. And I think, I hope we will move in that direction over time, and the technology will support that.
Michael?
What struck me as odd is that, and there's probably a good reason for this, but I just don't know it. Hence the question. You've spoken about 4G networks, but neither of you spoke of 5G networks. Surely 5G networks offer a potentiality for a more stable and greater bandwidth. And if we're talking about redundancy of networks, then shouldn't we be targeting our development towards the newest network that's available now, because that's likely to give us this longevity, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good point. We're also asked regularly, what about 5G? And I think that will come. You mentioned bandwidth. It's not really, well, certainly not for voice. You don't need much bandwidth at all. So it's not really a bandwidth issue.
We've alluded to video, and I can see that video is becoming hugely important. Otis are already suggesting that that's on its way.
Yeah, but you know, all of us here may use WhatsApp or Skype or something, and the video works pretty well over 4G. So 4G is there, the coverage is great. You have to look also at frequencies in the way in which they penetrate buildings. So that's very important as well, as to what 5G is operating on and what 4G frequencies there are as to the penetration. Because at the end of the day, this may still be mounted in a machine room or in a telecoms room somewhere. And although, of course, we can add external antennas for better reception, you will find a difference depending on what frequencies are used. Sorry, Matt.
No, definitely. I agree. Yeah, its coverage and its ability to penetrate into buildings today just isn't there. Will that come over time? Yes, I hope so. And they're doing a lot of work researching how they can essentially pull 5G networks into buildings. But as we stand here today, to offer a solution to the industry, the best bet is 4G from a performance point of view, certainly.
Yeah. I was going to ask the same question. That's 5G. That's all right. About the development of 5G.
Another question.
So, it's a standard mobile phone mast. Does that have a UPS?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's not a question of a sort of area around a substation losing.
No,
power.
Matt touched on it, and quite often on the mobile network side, the biggest problem can be in an emergency, a wide, you know, like unfortunately the Manchester bombing or something. There's an overload in the network. That can still occur. And I would mention on that in the US, AT&T has what's called FirstNet, and that was after the Boston bombing. They decided to hive off a bit of the frequency, some blocks, to be used for emergency responders and, kindly enough, elevators. We now have gateways in the US on AT&T approved for FirstNet. I think it's B14 or something, the channel, which should provide that surety that, okay, the rest of the network's overwhelmed, but the paramedics, the elevator passengers can get in touch and communicate. So I don't know that, I'm not aware that discussions really happened here in the UK. Matt probably knows. No. Okay. Well, that's something that should, I think, be considered after the experiences we've seen here and elsewhere.
The other comment I would make on power failure linked to the mobile network, when we were dealing with Swisscom in Switzerland, they noticed that in a power failure, their availability on their network went up because all of these little things like smart meters and so on go offline. So actually, they're in a better position in a power failure than they would otherwise be.
Didn't you ask about UPS?
Well, I did, but I got the answer.
Yeah, these the towers in urban areas will be probably have several ways. But you've also got to think of the towers scattered about the country, which are in rural areas. They'll have a UPS, but what is the battery strength on that? I can tell you on the fibre network I'm involved with in my rural area, which is called Broadband for the Rural North, our cabinets have got a 6-hour UPS in. So if we have a local failure, which would affect an area with which hasn't got power and has got power, the cabinet will stay up for 6 hours. And we have a system to actually take out generators. Obviously, a widespread power cut would be something you couldn't cope with, but area power outs can be coped with by relying on the 6 hours, monitoring it, and when it starts to dribble away, to put power back in. Now, maybe it's the fibre network that we ought to try and keep up, just like we kept the copper lines up. I mean, we kept the copper lines up, we keep them up because there's loads of batteries and generators in all the exchanges, isn't there?
Yeah.
So why don't we keep the fibre network up like we keep it up in my local area? Another question.
Was it last year when they had all those major power outages up in Scotland?
Yeah.
That lasted for a few days. So many people then.
Yeah. And most of those people had battery backups
Yeah,
on orders from
but
BT that BT hadn't been able to supply.
BT then said, well, we'll have to have a rethink of how we handle this.
That's very specific to their residential programs. So their messaging was quite mixed on this, but what they're talking about there was slowing the fibre rollout for individual residences. The rest of it, so like the build slide I showed you there, is absolutely going ahead in other areas. And interestingly, since they made that statement, I've not seen any update to it about what they're actually doing. I imagine they're just stockpiling battery backups, but they were selling those battery backups for £85 each, and they were failing to deliver them. But yeah, it was a big problem during the storms with people with overhead power, especially.
Few problems that we've kind of all been discussing that a lot of the network issues create seem to me to be covered in a lot of respects already by smartphones. So things like WhatsApp or Zoom or Teams. And I'm just wondering whether the new EN8128, which has kind of always traditionally relied upon things being tactile. I mean, people don't have tactile smartphones as far as I'm aware. So is there any kind of provision to introduce app-based technology within COPs to cover a lot of this kind of stuff? We make it a bit more accessible and easy to download.
We could put it into a little standard. We've been told by SEN and the European Union people that when we write a standard now, for lifts, it's just the lift. We don't say in an evacuation standard how the evacuation occurs. We've even been told the absurdity that we can't specify the door to the machine room. So there's no way of doing it there. But what you might be looking at, I think BT have some commitment for life safety, don't they, to keep up their copper lines in some way. For 999 calls, I've never heard of them failing actually. So do we not want a similar life safety thing for the mobile networks, that they must keep them up for 999 calls particularly?
I think they're pretty resilient mobile networks, generally speaking. But the comment I would make in regard to technology is, you know, when you do separate out, and you, in our view, you shouldn't, but when you separate out the voice call from the, let's say, the test calls, I was speaking with a company in Spain. They're getting the DTMF test calls, you could say, 3-day health check calls, through to WhatsApp. And they just look at it and they say, everything's fine, you know, they're getting on that. But that's not where they're getting the voice calls, you know, emergency calls when there's a trapping. So, yeah, I mean, it's going off in every direction as people are sort of finding the best way to do things. And that's why I come back to this idea of having guidance and ELA looking for standardization around, or support and standardization around VoIP. I think it would be very helpful to the industry to say, look, this is a way in which you can remain compliant with the standard in terms of same communication means, and yet still have the DTMF, the health check calls all be going through fine without any trouble, any distortion or problems.
Sorry, Jason, I know you mentioned that in passing about receiving the 3-day health check on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
How does that pick up? Phone that doesn't dial in? Because obviously it's not, the autodialer phones in and said, I'm healthy or I'm 40.
Yeah.
But an important part of it is identifying which autodialers didn't dial in, those ones that have failed completely, or the SIM cards run out of credit, for example.
Well, that's a good point as well, especially if you're running both the voice plan, as I say, separating the voice from the DTMF, maybe going over data, then what's actually happening with the SIM card is also important. But yeah, I mean, the auto dialer, the phone in the cab can identify itself. So on that string, you're going to get the lift ID. It's going to make the health check call, and you can see the log, and you can see by exception and flag which ones have not called, and very quickly identify that and go and investigate. So I can't speak more about that WhatsApp situation in Spain, how that's been designed and developed. But I merely point to the fact that companies are going off in each direction, trying to find something that works without great regard for the code, for the standard.
Yeah. And we're not given a lot of guidance in 8128 as to what the receiver for a 3-day test call should be. Yeah. And I remember being out in China when they were talking about their potential adoption of 8128, explaining to the customer what a 3-day test call was. And he went and pointed down into the car park. And I asked my translator what he was referring to. And she said, oh, the guy at the booth in the car park can pick up the phones and record them in a book. It'll be fine. So we always see these extremes, and ultimately, you're right, the receiver should be something where you can clearly see what calls have hit, but more importantly, which ones haven't. And to Jason's point, anything we can get which gives more industry guidance as to how that should work, the better. I'm never comfortable when people pick up alarm calls on mobile phones, particularly. But we know it happens. So yeah, it's all out there. No, and apart from having things like the please top up the credit on your mobile phones when we're testing auto dials for inspections. The other one is you're getting put into a queue. Your call is important to us. We'll answer, get to you as soon as possible. Yeah.
It's a little bit thunder was stolen a bit by Gina in the, fibre works if it's backed up.
Yeah.
Is that what we said? And we've got a lot of batteries in lifts inherently, particularly in your ones. We've got emergency devices that rely on the batteries. I'm not convinced they do stop the lift working. Perhaps they probably should if they're not fully charged. That discussion was tested on site. Last week I was on site and Kevin's gone, so I can talk about this and some of this. Yeah, I'm not sure. But there was a video of the person taking a call in Leicester. They couldn't see me, but I could see them. And of the 2 lifts we were checking on that day, one of them, the GSM didn't work properly. And the test tells us a signal. I need to go and play with it. And I don't know where the antenna was, but it was obviously installed on site and it didn't work. So if we've got batteries that are backing up, destination control elements, we're looking at new buildings, there's always a requirement for a backed up power in a machine room. I think the GSM thing and common projects, I'm also very aware of pay-as-you-go SIM cards running out. So are we not better concentrating on a robust solution for the backup power, whichever device it is?
Well, I think there are answers to that. I mean, from the gateway, Matt can comment as well, but certainly we provide a cloud-based solution where you can see the battery status, you can set alerts, you can see the signal strength if that's changed, again, get alerts. You have even a timer running. It's based generally on number of days installed for the batteries as to when they need to be replaced, the backup batteries. So I think there's quite a lot there that supports the resilience of the gateway and the power backup. As regards the SIM card, well, yeah, I mean, you put a prepaid card in and it runs out of credit, that's an issue. I think that's something the mobile industry should maybe pick up on and realize that a SIM plan needs to be designed around the needs of the lift industry. And one requirement is that it should always, like a 999 call, always be able to get through, maybe regardless of credit, and it's sorted out later if money is thereby owed. But that would be my wish list, is the mobile operators say, right, oh, it's for a lift, right? You want this particular SIM? Matt correctly said it should be roaming, be able to get to the strongest network, not tied to a particular network, and then doesn't have a very good signal. So, I've worked in the mobile industry. I worked for Vodafone for many years. I would like to see them do more. Unfortunately, as Matt also said, maybe they regard us as a niche of a niche, and but I would like to see more happen from their side.
But many other things in the building which require red line signal fire alarms and all those other.
Can you speak a bit louder? I'm partially deaf. I do hear the rude things, but
yeah, that's yeah, I can't.
speak to me, and then if
Yeah.
I'm nodding, I'm hearing. It's called
Yeah, no, we've got lots of other things in buildings that require red line communication, for want of a better description. And yeah, I just think there's so much in this topic, and it's brilliant to hear from you both. I'm not suggesting that we do away with GSM solutions in any way whatsoever, but I think there's so many things here, and so this topic, as you've said, is really important. But I'm a little bit wary of going down one route with it.
Well, sorry. So what I would say is, I'll be perfectly honest with you, if fibre lines worked, it would make my life so much easier. But what we have seen is we really get into these moving parts of what the communication providers are doing and what we as an industry are able to do, because there's even talk about, should you be allowing communication providers to site their comms equipment in the motor room, which is a little bit of a debate that's going on. But really, if we get it, we get the comms equipment set up, we get it plugged into a backup and so on. How's that backup monitored is always a question. And I think the other thing is, I always get nervous of equipment which is just plugged into a 3-pin plug on the wall, let alone plugged into the 3-pin plug on the top of the car. The trial site that I referenced, what we did at Galliard Homes, it was marked that we were stood one side of the landing with Coney at the control panel. The Sky guys were working in a riser cupboard on the other side. And when we came back to that install, we got to the top landing, the lift doors open, the riser cupboard door was open, and there was a cleaner with a Hoover plugged in. Now, luckily, he had a spare spot to plug it into. But it's things like that where it's the resilience piece for me. Gina alluded to with the copper was always there. The universal service agreement with the government has gone, and it's just degenerated now to that one line from Ofcom about vulnerable customers. We spoke to Virgin Media about what their solution was for vulnerable customers, and they showed us a home phone with a handset with a GSM built into the base of it. And the guy went, would that do for the lift industry? Not massively so. But their attitude is you could put that into somebody's home, they could dial 999 from it, and that's all they need to do. So could you do it on fibre? Yes, you could. The question is, who brings in that battery? Who's responsible for that battery? And where different things are sited and how comfortable we are. We understand what goes on the other side of the motor room door or the other side of the control panel. The guy with his Hoover plugged in on the other side of the landing is maybe not as safety conscious as we'd like him to be.
I should have those wind-up generators that they use for communication.
I would just add to that is the urgency. If 2025, the end of 2025, this all needs to be sorted. And really between there and now, the 4G mobile gateways provide an excellent solution, I believe. And I'm not saying years to come, there may not be, fiber-based solutions that have that resilience that we've been speaking about. But we need a sense of urgency, the understanding of the issues around the DTMF that I pointed out tonight that go along with the gateways, and that guidance potentially to the industry as to best practice or how to align with the standard, what works and the way to go about things. And I think the sooner that is done, the better, because again, we may see gateways deployed that aren't correctly set up. Matt again mentioned that quite often the gateways will default from VoLTE down to 2G, 3G, but when those networks no longer exist and it hasn't been set up correctly or the SIM is not for the voice over LTE service or something, they're not going to work. So there's I pinpoint the DTMF as being a #1 issue, but there's certainly other issues there that the industry could benefit from some guidance, best practice, and so forth.
Can I ask a question? So with the discussion we've been focused on is the Part 20 alarm and its need to communicate to a third party off-site. The other comms requirements we have in the lift industry relate to firefighters' lifts and a growing one to evacuation lifts. And the way the Part 76 is evolving, there are potential options for the way that an evacuation lift might work. One of those being remote. Now, we think at the moment that remote might be constrained to be, yes, it can be remote, but it still needs to be in the same premises. I'm just wondering whether there's another issue coming here, or whether firefighters and evac comms are simpler, and because they tend to be within the same building, it's not an issue. Is that right? Or am I
I mean, if we look at the fire communication system for 8172, that's a 3-point intercom just in the installation itself, so much simpler. 76 starts to complicate it slightly with this issue of remote. So when we had, the evac lift going, the evac communication system just going to a panel at the fire service access level, that again was fairly robust. My worry with allowing remote, even if it's on the site, is if the site infrastructure is not backed up. And again, we come back to a power failure and, we're backing up fire lifts, we're backing up evac lifts. If you've not backed the nodes in that link between the lift and wherever this remote site is, you may have the same problem that link fails.
You could choose to run that in copper, could you? And then you don't have the issue.
Yeah, I mean, provided it's essentially a closed intercom system.
Yeah.
If we're on the site.
Yeah.
If we allow remote evac, for want of a better way of describing it, I think that's why people get so concerned.
I can imagine big developments in London, like maybe Battersea or Olympia, where you've got a suite of buildings, and they might all be managed by one facilities management company. You have one office in the middle of the campus. That's starting to get pretty remote to hardwire connect, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, yes and no. In that I hasten to add that this idea of going back to copper and 2-wire for intercoms and so forth, we're all familiar with Ethernet and plugging Ethernet in and getting internet and all the rest. So many of these new developments are actually cabled up with infrastructure, network infrastructure, which allows for as rich as needed in terms of communication, because yes, there probably will be under the EVAC requirements for landing stations, for communication voice, but there may also be cameras, video needed to see, is there a fire or is there a smoke, or I don't know. I mean, you can have sensors as well. But again, they could be IoT based, IP related. So, you know, there's going to have to be this embrace of IP. And we shouldn't be scared about it. We use it every day in everything we do. So, you know, I think I would look, I mean, we're looking at EVAC and how we would do it. And it would be IP intercoms at each floor. Yes, with a terminal in the office, facilities office or wherever required for that. And then you can add as many within the lift. We can do, well, we use a 2-wire bridge, so you don't take cable, you don't have to run a structured cabling to the lift. 2-wire bridge can, again, deliver broadband Ethernet to the car itself. So you have the communications, you can make that richer with video to the cab as well, see what's in the cab. So, you know, I mean, as we spoke about earlier, many of us, and I include myself because I'm getting on in years, of a certain generation where we may understand it, others may be struggling, but as an industry, we need to, you know, recognize IP, VoIP, SIP, and how that can play a role in these communication needs. And it really can, it can deliver all of that. And yes, it needs the resilience in terms of power. So you need to look, okay, what are all the network elements that need to be supported around that? Yes, and that's not easy. But when you have a defined campus or building, you can very methodically then plan the UPSs that are required for that environment.
Okay. Yes, I've got a question on voltage. As we know, UK's 240 volts single phase, plus or minus. It's 216 to 253 volts. Now, most equipment is manufactured abroad to the 220 to 230 standard, but it's sold in the UK with our voltage difference. Have you got any experience of problems with the 220 to 230 volts working on our network? Because I've got a problem with the voltage. I'm quite close to the substation and I'm measuring 251 volts. So it's very close to the limit. Has anyone got any experience of this?
No, it's not a problem. It's not a problem I've encountered, certainly.
No. I particularly I'm worried about equipment I've bought.
Yeah.
Whether the warranty will be invalidated by having such a high voltage.
Well, in our case, it wouldn't. I mean, we obviously saying for that. We supply for this market, and it certainly wouldn't be anything from your side to have caused that. Therefore, return to the manufacturer, and if it's within the warranty, 3 years in our case, it would be replaced.
Yeah. So this is a 10-year warranty. And, I particularly I don't want to infringe it if the voltage is causing damage to their equipment.
I wouldn't have thought so. It's not something that you're making, that's for sure.
I think you need to report this.
Yes, yes, I'm going
They're
to report
supposed
it.
to keep it plus or minus 5%.
I'm dealing with the electricity supplier, and they've been around and identified the high voltage at my premises.
They put a data log on it. We're off this question of remote.
Yes, I've requested a data logger to be installed if I've requested that, but
What are you doing?
Yeah.
I think this question is sort of out of the range.
Yes, I know, but I thought I'd ask the experts.
Okay.
Here, if they've
Is there
got
any
any
other questions on the digital stuff, please? One more.
Just one last comment. I take the point that was made by one of our colleagues earlier about lots of large UPSs being around buildings already. And it strikes me, one of the things about this is that, particularly from the Menco side, over the years, you've got very good at fitting your equipment into other bits of the lift equipment. So your speaker units and that integrate into the COPs and all the rest of it. I'm just wondering whether or not we ought to now be incorporating the whole of the equipment associated with the lift within the controller. So that we've just got, if we need a UPS for the lift, then the UPS is going to have to be properly monitored. And we don't need to be monitoring dozens of different devices. We can monitor one. And similarly, the control panel then has all the features that it needs to be able to communicate any diagnostics through the same channel to the people that need to hear it in one package, rather than it coming from several different sources to different people, and perhaps the message not getting through to the person that needs it.
So I think a monolithic UPS provided for the whole lift installation would be a good thing. Again, I go back to, and Jason showed it very well in his slides, the transmitter, i.e. all the comms equipment, sits outside of our standard. So getting that inside the perimeter and understanding who's then responsible for it, we've definitely seen as being problematic.
Yeah.
And as I've said to you, we've had questions raised about should fibre routers be being put into motor rooms, because it's now not, technically speaking, non-lift equipment being bought in.
I think that's a rubbish argument, by the way.
Yeah, but associated with the lift.
Yeah,
If you read the wording in
It's like he's lost less communications we've got in London Underground's lift and
I mean, this principle of there being one set of monitoring that covers every aspect of the lift is something that is, I mean, it's already here with Otis One. Connie have got a similar product with it. So all of that information is being handled in a central, big data way. And that really would give you an opportunity of working with the control panel manufacturers or the lift manufacturers, and then having a product that was more integrated into the lift as a whole, rather than being left as sort of like a do-it-yourself add-on.
and I think if you look at the generation of lifts that are coming in now, they are fully digital. They've got all of this. My concern is the 300,000 we've already got out there, some of which may be 30 years old, which don't have that UPS and so on. So my view of the market is always, the new stuff coming in will be the latest and greatest, and that's fantastic. But we've still got tower blocks and nursing homes and so on that need to be worked on, and you don't necessarily have that scheme.
No, but if you think that typically the life of the lift controller is about 15 years, then if your equipment is going to be part of what's replaced every time that controller's renewed, then that's a good way of keeping all the equipment up to date, and so they're on a current compatible version of whatever operating systems they're using.
And we're seeing that level of integration occur more and more. So it wouldn't surprise me if, as we move forward, I can see a world where the emergency telephone is a board within the controller and everything is handled in one way. And we're already seeing an element of a move towards that from the majors, from the new lift manufacturers. So I suspect it will come. The issue will be it won't come before the end of 2025.
Yeah.
But you do see the gateways quite often supporting the lift monitoring. So you don't want to be paying for two SIMs and the costs and the hassle associated with that. So you've usually got a CAN bus or RS232, RS485, whatever. So you can, through that mobile gateway, connect any data from the controller itself. So you're dealing with one box, one gateway, and I think that's quite useful. But I understand your point about consolidating the power redundancy, but these mobile gateways, one benefit is that, and we do see this, by the way, is not the lift companies, but maybe the facilities manager, the building manager, taking it upon themselves to fit the gateway, the mobile gateway. So they'll know where the landline is terminated, where it's connected to the lift outside of the machine room, maybe in a telecoms cabinet or room or something, and they'll go there and with some degree of coordination, I would say, but fit the mobile gateway and plug the landline coming in and the line from the lift plugged into the gateway, and then proceed to do some test call. And then most importantly, you are changing the number associated with that phone in the lift. So I would always suggest that they well, very quickly and in writing, inform the lift company, the maintenance company, or whoever's taking those calls that the number has changed. There's now a mobile gateway there. It's no longer whatever the landline number was. And this is now the number. And as I said, do a test call, see that the operator picks up and it's working normally. But it's not a bad thing, I think, to take it outside. Well, we see it doesn't sit within the code. Therefore, it doesn't necessarily have to be the lift company alone doing the mobile gateway, the switch over from landlines to the mobile gateways. It's not particularly involved. It can be done by building maintenance engineers and the like.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a good go at this, and there will be other questions, so you need to leave the table hungry with that. So I'd like to thank the two speakers for